My name is Mason. I am a senior software engineer for the cloud platform team at Verbo. HomeAway changed their name. It's a big mess. We're known as HomeAway, Verbo, and Expedia, so you can call me whatever you want. It's one big, large, happy family now. I'm a volunteer educator with a program called TEALS, which is a Microsoft program for teaching computer science in high schools inside the United States, where there may be school districts that don't have anybody that has any training in teaching computer science. So I volunteer a couple times a week teaching computer science courses at local schools, and I'm a documentation fanatic, mostly good documentation fanatic. If you have bad documentation, I will let you know about it. So quick thing, who is this talk for? This talk is for open source maintainers, developers of any level, community managers, project managers, all of that jazz, DevOps engineers, the list goes on and on and on. But in reality, this talk is for anyone who wants to write some code, maintains or manages a code base, and would like to share it with anybody else outside of themselves. So let's first take a look at how we manage documentation and the current tool sets and mindsets we have around this. So a common approach to documentation exists something like this. The developer writes some code, the developer commits this code, the code goes through reviews and testing, either automated or manual. We ask ourselves, is it time to release our code? If we say no, the developer rejoices. They go back to writing code. They don't have to deal with the nasty release processes. If they say yes, they groan internally, and then somebody has to write some form of documentation. This is a very common pattern that I've seen at a lot of software engineering companies that I've worked for. That someone could be a developer, the developer who wrote the code. It could be a technical writer if your company has technical writers. It could be a different developer who wasn't on the project or was adjacent to the project. It could be the new hire. This is a good way for you to get started. Write the docs. By the way, if you want the world's worst docs on earth, make the person who knows nothing about the project write the documentation. Okay, you're better off getting docs from DevUrandom. Or you can make the interns do it, because instead of getting coffee now, they write our docs. Again, great way to have terrible documentation. So the issues with this approach. The documentation is almost an afterthought in this setup. Long release cycles can lead to things being forgotten. I know that a lot of us aim to work in an agile methodology and work with 2-week sprints and the perfect little developer box. I've never actually seen one of those work before. I've just never had that opportunity. My first job, we built a hardware device and we had a release cycle of 8 months. So if you asked me what I had done in my first 2 weeks, writing part of the platform code on that versus at the very end, I'd be like, I don't remember. Did I write that code? And then I do a git blame, and I'm like, oh no, I wrote that code. So long cycles can lead to things being forgotten. The more layers of separation we introduce between the person who actually wrote the code and the person who wrote the docs means that we're going to lose accuracy. While technical writers are great at polishing our ideas, a technical writer should not be like the primary author of your documentation, because they don't know how the product works, unless they just happen to be a very technical writer, and I have met a handful of those. The likelihood is they're not just dedicated to your team. They're writing docs for the entire company, and this week is their week to work on your team stuff, so they don't really have time to get into the nitty-gritty. So in reality, your technical writers, if you have them, should always be more around polishing than about creation. And the other thing is that developers dislike document. They don't like documentation because they dislike this workflow, and that's actually something that we need to focus on, is that the developers dislike documenting, which is a weird thing, because why do our developers dislike documentation? We enjoy writing our code. We enjoy talking about our code. We come to conferences and talk about our code. We're in Slack talking about our code. So why don't we enjoy writing about what we do? Instead of talking about it, we just write it. Heck, with text-to-speech now, you can even talk your docs if you really want to. So why do we not like documentation? Why is it like the last thing on everybody's brain? And the real issue with this isn't the fact that we don't like writing documentation. Developers don't like writing documentation. They despise the workflow that we're using. So a developer has to switch tools when they want to document something. This is outside of encode documentation, something like Sphinx docs or PyDoc, where you would be writing it in the code base. So if I'm writing a how-to guide on how to use my service, I have to now close my text editor, go to a browser, open up, some wiki system, some notepad, something somewhere else that is not code, and I have to write my docs. And this context switch makes developers really reluctant to write docs. So in the end, they just keep getting pushed off. Oh, I'll deal with that. We'll write a ticket. I'll put it in the backlog. I'll deal with that at the end of the development process. And this is how you get inaccurate docs, because again, every day you don't touch that code, you're forgetting what you did. So how can we integrate our documentation process into a workflow that developers will actually enjoy? And so we have to ask ourselves, well, what if we just treat our docs like code? What if instead of having our docs external to our code, all of our documentation lived right alongside the code, perhaps even in the same repo? What if instead of using a terrible WYSIWYG or some other form of online editing tool where I have to learn somebody else's version of Markdown this week, I can use just regular Markdown inside of, say, what GitHub would normally use, and use that to write all of my documentation? What if we just did that? Sounds like a pretty simple thing. Then we don't have to switch editors. I can open up a new tab in Vim or VS Code or whatever I'm using to edit my documentation. So first, let's see, what do we mean when we say let's treat our docs like code? This means that our doc files should be stored in a version control system. The documentation and the artifacts should be built automatically every time, preferably every time we do a PR. We ensure that a trusted set of reviewers meticulously review our documentation, and docs are tested. And I know a lot of people think, oh, what, we test docs? Yes, you actually should be testing your documentation. They are tested for both accuracy and functionality. And we publish the artifacts without much human intervention. So what do we gain from this? Well, this promotes collaboration. From now on, I can now have PRs, and in my Git flow, I can see all who's worked on the docs. And now, instead of having to go and find a new system every time I want to do something, it's the same thing as doing a code pull. We can track our documentation mistakes as bugs. When I was first introduced into the Unix space, my mentor had the wonderful idea of introducing me to OpenBSD, because he's like, if you can do things in OpenBSD, you can do them anywhere. And it's true. The OpenBSD community treats documentation errors as a critical bug. Like, they are so dedicated to their documentation that whenever a bug comes in their docs or in their man pages, it's like a P2 or a P1 bug in their backlog, and they fix it immediately. Because if you have bugs in your documentation, you can't tell people it's in the docs, which is a very favorite phrase of a lot of people that write code. We can now include docs in code review. So now I've added a new feature, I've added a new API endpoint. Well, how do I know the user's going to know how to use this? Well, if the documentation is in your code, then now you can say, hey, I'm not letting this pull request through until you have a code review or you have documentation in your code review, and I can see it right there. And it lets us add a more meticulous look at our documentation. We're really good at looking at code and making sure that we haven't messed anything up. We're good at looking at the diffs in GitHub and all of that stuff. If we put the docs there, we can do the exact same level of granularity as with our docs. It allows us to make beautiful documentation. I got into backend engineering, so I never had to deal with JavaScript ever. It's a thing I don't do. So I don't want to know how pretty the docs are, or I want them to be pretty. I don't want to write any of the stuff that has to do with it. I want to deal with text, and I want it to spit out pretty, which is what some of the tools we'll talk about later in this presentation do. So now we can have an automated process that automatically formats our docs into a way that makes them easily accessible for everyone, and I don't have to worry about it. Or at the most, I only have to worry about it for a short amount of time. I just bite my tongue and write JavaScript and CSS and HTML, and then now I have it working, and I never have to touch that part again. It allows us to leverage developer tools and workflows. We have spent a lot of time perfecting our workflows. We have agile processes and Git, and we have all these really great tools and workflows that help us become better developers. If we take these workflows and apply them to our documentation, we can now iterate on our docs just as quickly as we iterate on our code. And by doing this, it empowers our developers to document. They don't have to go searching for the documentation in a wiki where the search function stopped working 20 years ago. They can just use whatever they want, they use their favorite text editor, and they can just write it in Markdown or restructured text or whatever you would choose to use. So I've introduced something similar to this at pretty much every job I've ever worked at, but I wanted to do a quick little case study at HomeAway when I first started. So there was a new team that was spun up to work on some cloud provisioning tooling. It was a new GitHub organization in GitHub. There were new team members, everything. It was a brand new team. I was put on the team as kind of like an auxiliary member to help with some of the cloud init stuff while I was taking a break from the other thing that I was doing. The first repository we added to the organization in GitHub was the documentation repository. And it was actually just a repo that contained the long-form documentation, or just this is what the project is, this is our architecture designs, this is how we've done everything. In GitHub, it was the first repo that was there. These docs were the most up-to-date and well-maintained in the department, and probably in the entire company. Every time they had a sprint retrospective, the first thing they would start off with was like, this is what we changed, and here's the change in the docs to know about it. No, we had to deal with very minimal support questions on this product because the docs were so up-to-date that 98% of our support questions were being handled through our documentation, because every time we had an error, we would update it and update the docs accordingly. So if we treat our docs like code, how does this change the current workflow that we're accustomed to as developers? Well, instead of just writing code now, I write my code and then say I update the docs at the same time. I've added a new REST API endpoint, and now I add it into either my Swagger doc or whatever I'm using to document this. And then I commit the code in the docs, it goes through, we say, hey, we've got some code review and some testing. We do our code review, we test the docs and the code, we review both the docs and the code at the same time, make sure that what I say I'm actually doing is what I actually am doing. We make that decision again, is it time to release? No, hooray, we go write more code because that's what we like to do. If the answer is yes, we just hit a button probably in our CI process that says release, and now not only is our product being released out into the world through the means of continuous deployment, now our documents are also out there, and I have to do zero effort after the fact to make sure that people have seen the docs. Like, they're updated and it's part of the code base. It's part of the deployment process. So what are some tooling and some CI/CD tools that I can have for documentation? Well, first off, let's define what CI/CD is. So it stands for continuous integration and continuous deployment. Continuous integration means that our code is continuously tested and integrated with every change that we make. So every time I push a git commit up, it should automatically be running some unit tests on my code. It should be maybe doing a couple integration tests. If I'm merging in, it should be doing some builds and all of that. We should be doing all of this through our continuous integration process. Our continuous deployment process means that every time that we merge code in or every time that we release, it's automatically pushed out. So it means that code is continuously deployed with each pass in the entire code base. So yes, we deploy it out automatically, very little human interaction. Probably still a teeny bit of human interaction, because once the robots completely take over, that's how you get automated outages. I have once seen an outage caused and then fixed by a robot, and it's kind of fun to watch. So I don't recommend it. It makes your boss sweat. So what does this mean for docs? For docs, CI/CD means that we should be building a full artifact of the docs with every single patch. So every time I do a merge into master, if that's how you choose to do things, I should be building a new version of those docs. If there is a released artifact of if there's a released versioned artifact, I should have a released version of the docs that coincides with that artifact. I should be continuously testing content with each patch. If I have long-form documentation, this could mean like manual testing to make sure that the stuff is actually accurate. But depending on the tooling you're using, there is a lot of automated testing you can use around your docs. Who's ever gone to a documentation site and clicked on a hyperlink and the hyperlink was dead? Yeah, isn't that frustrating? If you're using Sphinx, there's actually a thing you can use that can test and run through and make sure all of your hyperlinks accurately resolve. Now here's the fun one. Who's ever used documentation and the code example was wrong? Yeah. And then you're sitting there and you're like, well, I'm stupid because I can't figure out why this isn't working. And you realize, no, it wasn't me, it was the docs. Again, we're going to go over this in a little bit later. Sphinx has a wonderful tool for doc test if you've never seen the Python doc test library, where you can actually test your code examples against your library, and it will work out and make sure, hey, you're lying, that's not how it actually works. Yeah, it's pretty cool. You should be publishing these docs automatically with every release, and you should version your docs. All docs should be versioned, because you never know. Depends on how long has your project been out. My first job, our product had been out for 15 years, and there wasn't versioning on the docs. There was versioning on the hardware appliance, but there wasn't any version on the docs. I was like, oh, good, we get to see which version of this works today. Oh, this says to use SOAP. Well, that obviously happened in the 90s. It's not valid anymore. Types of documentation. So there's a couple of different types of documentation. One of which you're probably going, well, I write PyDoc tests, or I write PyDoc comments. I already have my docs in code. That's one form. One of the forms we have is what's known as long-form documentation. These are our user guides, our getting starteds, our FAQs. These are the documents that don't directly get generated out of a code base. So welcome to my project. Here's how you install it. You don't find that in like your dunder init file in a Python file. This is docs that have to be written somewhere else. Functional documentation, such as REST APIs, SDKs, things like that. This is the kind of code or the kind of documentation that you will generally see from your code base. So if you're using Python and Sphinx, you will have probably seen PyDoc. If you use Java, JavaDoc. Every language has some form of in-code documentation tool. So the different types of tools that we have around this that can help aid us with this is where we have static site generators. These are good for your long-form documentations, your FAQs, run books, all of that. We have an entire site at my job for all of our run books that tell us how to handle the system if the system explodes, and they're versioned and done through this exact process. We can use source code-based documentation generators. Again, this is something that you're probably familiar with. You've seen Sphinx, Code, PyDoc, JavaDoc, stuff like that. Some even generate testing clients. Swagger does this. Some of the gRPC things do this. So they can get more and more complicated as you go on. And some system documentation generators. This one I put in here for fun because I found a markdown-based man page generator, and I think it's the coolest thing ever because it's called ronn, and ROFF is the format for man pages, and ronn is the opposite of ROF, and it's the stupidest joke ever, but it makes me laugh, so it gets a place in the presentation. And one of the best pieces of advice I've ever heard, and this came from Drew Levine, who is one of the core documentation and core contributors of the FreeBSD project, is that the more powerful your documentation tool is, the more complex it is to use. So if you're using stuff like Microsoft Word or Mkdocs, it's fine. Swagger is a little bit weird. Sphinx, I very much believe there's not a single human being on earth that knows every feature in Sphinx. I think Sphinx modifies itself to keep it this way. So, some cool documentation tools that I've come across and the ones that I use on a day-to-day basis. For long-form documentation, Mkdocs. It is probably my favorite tool, and there are so many projects inside of Verbo that are written with this tool. So it's a markdown-based documentation with a single YAML config file. That's it. Your time to hello world on Mkdocs is about 30 seconds. There's a Mkdocs new project and a Mkdocs serve, and you have a site, and it runs super fast. It's easy to configure. There are many extensions and many themes supported. This is what I'll be doing the demo over today, so you get to see it. It is Python-based, so it's super easy to extend and modify. All the themes are in Jinja 2, so you can easily just pull out a theme, create your new theme, all of that, super easy. One of my favorite features about it is it supports UML extensions from Markdown. So one of the things that I've seen is that you create a diagram inside of your code, and then you're like, okay, well, I made it in this editor, then I screenshot it, and I put it in my docs, and now I've left the company. That was on my personal file of Giphy or Glyphy or whatever tool we're using today, and now I'm gone, and now I have to recreate the entire thing if I ever want to update it. And then a lot of times we're like, well, if we have to update the documentation, let's just not change the architecture of the project, because recreating that tool is way harder than this. So it doesn't happen. It's satire, but I actually had one person tell me that once. So you can use just basic Markdown, and you create a simple code block, and it will generate your sequence and flowchart diagrams for you. This is one of my favorite features that I use all the time. Okay, so the other documentation tool that probably most people that have ever done any sort of Python documentation in here are used to is Sphinx. Sphinx is a restructured text-based documentation tool with support for Markdown. It's the most common tool for creating SDK documentation encode documentation for Python. It can output literally to any media format, including LaTeX, which is just insane because I can barely write LaTeX, but Sphinx apparently understands it. I'm pretty sure if you asked it, it could output to stone tablets. It may be sentient. We are currently uncertain. I have seen amazing things done with Sphinx before. One of the cool things that it has is it has documentation testing. So anything that I put inside of my documentation with the Python REPL angle brackets, I can then I can do a doc test on it, and what it actually does is it will build my project, install my project, run my project, and make sure that my code in my project actually does what it says I've done. And I've actually caught, this is where it's fun, I've caught errors in here that made it through the unit tests. And they were actual bugs in the code base. And I'm like, well, the unit test didn't cover all of this, but the documentation testing did. So it's another place to test your code, and it's to make sure that you don't lie to your users. This again, ronn. This is what a Markdown version of a man page looks like, and this is what it outputs. So if you're interested in that, you should use it. It's really cool. Okay, demo time. So first off, I'm going to kind of paint a picture of like what I was trying to solve with this whenever I created this teeny tiny project. So I needed to be able to create many open source texts. I'm working on an educational project that open sources a lot of textbooks or writes my own textbooks because I'm tired of paying for them. All with a similar format with a production ready to go out the box. I don't want anyone to have to worry about building the texts. This should just all magically appear. I want a workflow to jumpstart docs writers. This is also a secret project of I'm tired of re-implementing this at every job that I go to, so I'm going to make an open source project so the next time I change jobs, I already have it ready for me. Because I've re-implemented this thing about 3 times. So my solution, the author wants to generate some docs, then the author will write docs, they publish the documentation, and then the docs are published to a hosted solution. The tooling that I chose to use this is Cookie Cutter, which is a general Python project generator. Then we edit the docs with your favorite text editor, IDE, whatever you want to do. We push the docs, that's the equivalent of our publish, and then it publishes automatically to GitHub pages. So the demo is a video because I learned a long time not to test the gods of live demos. It only takes one failed live demo requiring a network before you never do it again. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to cookie cut a project that you can get from this GitHub repo. It will be on a later slide so you can see it. And you say, it asks you a couple of questions, asks me if I want to re-download it. Yeah. This is the demo that I did when I did PyTexas, so this will be a lot very PyTexas-y themed. If you ever want to go up to PyTexas, I think it's next May, you should definitely check it out. We give it a description, a repository name. The repository name is what I want it to be in GitHub. I bumped the, we're going to wait for it. Oh no. Is it still going? It's still going. Good for you. We can just back up a little bit. So we give it a repository name, my name, site author, GitHub username. That actually has to be correct. Otherwise it doesn't work and you spend 3 times rewriting your demo. You can choose which license you want to use it for. You can choose which documentation engine you want to. I'm going to stop bumping the cable because it is angry at me. Come on. Either way, you choose which engine you're going to use, where you want to publish it to, how you want to do continuous integration. I haven't built out all the different CI and other tools yet. I build them out as I need them. PR is accepted. So now we ask, what do I get? Well, you automatically get a Docker file, a make file, a pip file, because I use pipenv for managing my dependencies, a README, a license file, and other stuff. This is this is the default file you get for the configuration. There's a lot of stuff that I added in there that I just never want to figure out how to make it work again, so you've gotten everything. It can actually be a lot less. This is just your sample Mkdocs file that you would get. Now you ask, how do I use this locally? I can just run. Well, first I have to lock my dependencies, otherwise it screams at me. Then I do a make build. I fast forward the build process as I'm building the Docker image to run this. And then I do a make run. If you don't want to use makefile or don't really care to, all the commands in there are super simple. I just use this to abstract out a lot of the stuff. I go to localhost 8000, and this is a documentation site that I have built. It was set up ready for me to go in less than probably 30 seconds once you run this file and build your Docker image. So if I want to change something in it, I just go into my markdown file, and I add PyTexas is awesome. It is. You should go. Do a make run again. Okay, Mkdocs basically just uses the Python server to host a website locally. And we're easily able to upload it or update it. Now I can use, I use Byobu, which is just a fancy Tmux wrapper, over it so I can edit it, and then at the same time so I can leave the server running and just see my changes in real time as I'm updating it, so I don't have to keep bouncing back and forth between rerunning Mkdocs serve and all that. It does handle live updates. This is when I forget that if you don't put spaces after a line, it doesn't do a new line in Markdown, so we're going to change that. We go back over here and refresh, and it fixes it. So you set up your Git repo and push. I'm not going to show you how to set up a GitHub repo, but essentially you can push it all up to your Git. Once you have it ready, you push it all up to GitHub. Travis automatically detects our build because it does come with a .travis.yaml file, and your README will take you straight to your build if you have your Travis integration set up properly. So it goes over to Travis, and it's going to build for us. And this one failed, and it intentionally failed. They go, oh no, it failed, what? What? Why did it fail? Well, this happens a lot. I forget that there's a GitHub token that is in the Travis script, so if you're going to use this thing, you're going to run into this if you're going to use my cookie cutter. So make sure you set up your GitHub token, have it set up for all of that. I'm going to show you how to create a GitHub token. I already deleted this GitHub token, so people with fast cell phones won't be able to grab my GitHub token. Just give it simple repo access. You've got the token. You come into Travis and you configure your project to appropriately use the token. We add that there. And now we can go back and restart our build. And we go to the link in there, and if you can see up the top, it is now my personal GitHub pages page, and it is working. And because we want to show this is truly a CI/CD system, not a one-off, I just change one more thing and say, hey, one more time, and I repush, and it will go through the entire process again and automatically update my site. If you find yourself, all these slides are posted on my personal website, and if you find my personal website, which is just masonegger.com, and I'll have a slide at the end, it does this exact same process. It uses a slightly different tooling because I use a different static site generator, but I do have this entire process where I update my web page, I push it to GitHub, my web page will automatically be updated. I don't have to do any deployment work on it whatsoever. So, can you try this yourself? Yes, you can. This is part of the Unlocked EDU open source project that in my spare time gets a little bit of attention. This is about building open educational resources for teachers. All of the books that are currently being written, there's an AP Computer Science A Java book that I'm writing with my little brother, and a one-act version play of Macbeth that my theater director wrote when I was in high school, are written in Mkdocs. The cookie cutter project that you can use can be found at that URL. You can just cookie cut that thing, and it will work for you, and you'll have a fully functioning pipeline. Sources that I used for this presentation, where Ann Gentle wrote a great book and was pretty much a big inspiration on this project called Docs Like Code. I highly recommend it if you want a much more in-depth process of how to start changing your documentation to act like code. Final thoughts. Every place I've ever implemented this workflow at, the documentation has improved like surmountably. The amount of people that come up and say, hey, we love your docs now, or the support burden that has been taken off because we're paying this much more attention to our docs is huge. And mostly this happens because developers like the process now. It's not hard to get developers to write good docs. It's hard to find good tooling in which they don't hate you for it. Stop making docs a punishment. That's not a good way to make good docs at all. In reality, docs should be when you have a new ticket, code, testing, docs should be all part of one ticket. I don't recommend splitting them up because that's how you get those docs tickets pushed to the back of the backlog and never written. If your docs suck, people will abandon your project. That's a known good. We live in a world of README engineering where there's 400 different projects to do the exact same thing that I want it to do, and if I'm trying to build a successful, sustainable project and people can't figure out how to use my project, I will move on to the next GitHub repo that tells me how to do it. So you have to put documentation on the forefront, especially if you're trying to be an open source contributor. Because if people can't use it, they're not going to use it, and then eventually, even if you change it, this project will garner a reputation for, hey, I can't really use this, and people don't use it anymore. Versioning your docs is great. We should do a lot more of that. Every time you released a version part of your artifact, you should be releasing a version of your docs. The slides are already available on my website if you are curious about them. And I have time for questions at perfect timing. That worked well.
Yes, we will be taking questions. So, anybody? Oh.
Hello, do you recommend these documentation tools for not technical writers?
Yes, so one of the cool things about using Markdown-based formatting is it's very easy to teach either non-technical writers or technical writers that are not programmers how to use them. At my first job, we did all of our docs in a format such as this, and the technical writers were able to pick them up within a couple weeks. We had to teach them how to use Git, and we had to teach them a simple, but if you just use the Git UI that you can download from GitHub and use it on your machine, our technical writers who were educational doctorates in English were contributing up to our docs and had little to no problems with it because we spent a week teaching them Git, and then Markdown takes maybe an afternoon to figure out how to make it work. And because they could run the docs locally on their machine, they could edit the docs, and if they didn't like the way something looked, like maybe they made a mistake in the Markdown, they could quickly fix it, or they could ping me on Slack or something, and I could explain to them how to fix it, and they were able to easily do it. So yes, the whole purpose of using Mkdocs is one, so that or Markdown-based documentation is so that one, your developers, we almost all pretty much know how to write Markdown. It's really simple, and it lowers the barrier for all of the documentation writers that maybe don't have the technical experience. And it also really helps, by lowering that barrier, it helps you get contributors to your project, because say maybe you have a student in university or something who wants to contribute. They don't feel quite comfortable contributing to C Python, but maybe the localization for a certain language is bad and they want to work on the translations, or maybe they just hate my grammar and they're like, you don't put a period there, and they want to fix that. So yeah, it's a great tool. It empowers pretty much everybody to be able to contribute to the project.
Hi.
Hi.
I run our documentation team
Okay.
at Linode.
Okay.
Have you thought about adding spell check, grammar, and style as a continuous integration test into this?
So yes, there are a handful of command line based spell check tools and grammar tools. I have not done enough work on that yet to know enough about it, but I know they're there. The one that I have, whenever I write these at work, I have a command line spell check tool that's kind of okay. One of the things about spell check tools that's difficult is tech uses a lot of acronyms, and we use a lot of words that in no way mean anything in any other language, but they mean something to us, and it usually makes my spell check tool very, very unhappy with me. So I spend a lot of time adding words to its dictionary, so it's like, yes, CICD is a real word, leave me alone, spell checker. Yes, but we should definitely have those kind of things in there, especially if you're publishing them for like a grander audience. You should definitely have spell check and grammar check things, because whenever there are a lot of spelling mistakes or a lot of grammatical mistakes, people tend to take your docs a little bit less seriously because they think they look slightly unprofessional. So yes, you should definitely add those in if you have the opportunity and you know how to use that tooling. I should probably add that to this demo.
You should come talk to me after this.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. So far it's just been me, and it's like me on my little project, and it's like, I'm not okay. Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
Can we use cookie cutter with other systems other than GitHub? For example, my current employer has a very serious case that everybody wants to get murdered by the next programmer that comes into work here. So there is a lot of legacy code also,
Yes.
which nobody knows how exactly it works, or the documentation is written very poorly, and the guy who wrote it left the place many ages ago.
Yes, so my cookie cutter uses GitHub, and I think it only sets like one variable, which is in the Mkdocs configuration, that says, hey, this is where the project is hosted. So if you just said none to the GitHub question in here, you could totally generate this. This project does not require you to use a version control system or a CI system. You can say no to both of those questions if you just want to get the product working and then maybe add your own in later. These are just the quick and easy ones that I added because I was tired of constantly doing them myself. So yes, you could totally use this without Travis and without GitHub. And if you do if anybody in here gets it working for like GitLab CI or something, feel free to submit a pull request because I'll accept them.
Hi.
Hey.
What's your opinion on live API documentation, like the inline type tools produced by some of the Swagger type clients where you have you fill the things in and hit post and it does it?
I actually really like those. I know some people, I have a couple of coworkers that are not the biggest fan of them. They think that they're ugly, and I'm like, I can live post to my API and I don't have to remember the 1,600 things I have to pass to curl to make it work. So I really like them. The only thing you have to be worrisome about that is how much of that if your API is like not super terribly secure and stuff, you don't have to worry about exposing that on a public port and worrying about it. But if you're like worried about somebody, maybe it has stuff that's internal or might be behind some auth, you might want to think about that. But I love them. I think they're a great tool. Swagger is really awesome. Yeah. Any other questions?
I think we have time for one more question.
Yes.
Hey, thank you for the talk. My question is more not regarding technical thing. It's more like a cultural thing.
Okay.
In your opinion, what is the best approach to change the mind, the scope of the culture of the companies to avoid or to hate documentation?
So, okay, that's a great question, and I've dealt with this everywhere. Basically you have to be the change you want to see in the world. If you start writing good docs and people start going to your docs and they're like, hey, I like this, they will start to be, maybe I should do this with my docs. Every place that I've gone, we've been the example of this is what good documentation should be, and other teams slowly start migrating towards that because they see how much they see how much they love our docs and they see how much success we have. And then if it's a team that has a support burden and they see that we have a lot of our like FAQs that handle common issues with, say, our product, like my paths, for example, they will be like, oh, well, if I wrote docs, then maybe people would read the docs first, and then then I wouldn't have to answer the same question 600 times in my Slack channel every day because somebody has, yet again, like they just didn't know it. So the way to start with that is just you be the example, write good documentation. It does kind of start to catch and grow, and evangelize your documentation. Every time we have somebody pop into our support channel now, we have a little Slack bot that says, I see you're asking a question. Have you read the docs? And even though it probably annoys some of the users that are more power users, most people haven't seen that, and they go to our docs, and the amount of times I see somebody enter the Slack channel, and then they get that message, and then immediately leave the Slack channel is growing every day. Like, I look and I'm like, that's a lot of them, because people are finding their information from the docs. So yeah, start off on your team and let it kind of culminate, and eventually it will get through the company. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Mason, for that talk. And everyone, let's give another round of applause to our speaker.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.